There we go. There we go. Well, today we are looking at the lessons for this coming Sunday, which is the proper 16 in year A in the lectionary. And let's do a little screen share there. Welcome to our Bible study today. Let's see. You should be looking at the lectionary page. There it is. We are, let's see if we go down here. Isaiah is not exactly, it's one of the servant songs. It's not exactly related to the scripture lessons for today. So I'm going to kind of skip over that. The Romans lesson is a good one. So we're just going to kind of read that just for our edification. It's the beginning of Romans 12, which is, I think, a very important passage for us as members of a parish community in particular, because it talks about the gifts that are given. This is something that we concentrated on early on in my tenure here at St. Luke's. And in fact, I went back, I dug down into my archives, my file archives at St. Luke's when I was the interim. And one of the first things I do with a vestry when I come to a new community is what I call the Roman 12s exercise, which is to have a list of all the spiritual gifts that Paul lists for a community in his various letters. And I asked the leadership of the community to take a parish directory and to list all of the people in the parish and say, which gifts do you know that people have? And so because of what he says in this particular passage, which is essentially the second paragraph that's listed here, that basically that these gifts are given in proportion to faith, ministry and ministering, the teacher and teaching, exhorter and exhorting, and so on. But they're all given for the sake of the community, to build up the community, to build up the church. And so that in Corinthians, we hear particularly that these gifts are given not for the edification of any particular individual. In other words, God doesn't give them to us for our personal benefit, but rather that each one of us is given a particular gift or several gifts for the sake of others, for the sake of building up the body of Christ. So that we never should revel in our own gifts, but rather that once we identify that we have a gift, not only should we realize that we have been given these gifts and become aware of them, but we then must take the responsibility for developing them and using them for the sake of building up the body of Christ, which we know as the church. That by the church, we don't mean only the parish community per se, but the church as a global entity, as this notion which we know of as the body of Christ. And so that he begins the chapter by saying, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. This is one of the verses that is often used, or is actually outlined in the prayer book as one of the offertory sentences. We don't often use it, but it is one that is outlined there. So it is one that is very helpful to us. Do not, and I've used this in a stewardship campaign a few years ago. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Christ, and individually we are members one of another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Prophecy in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness. And I just want to reach back to my table back here. And with the work of the vestry at that time, this is the chart they came up with. These are all the various gifts that Paul outlines. It's across 2 pages, actually. You see? That's because it's a long column. And these were all the people in the directory under each of the gifts. You can't read it. Unfortunately, you see some that have crossed out because I updated it, and those are the people that are either no longer with us because God has called them home, or they have left our fellowship because they moved away, or they've just not associated themselves with us anymore. But you know what the greatest learning was, interestingly, at that time, is how many people the leadership of the vestry did not know in our parish. Because they could say, they would look at the directory and they would say, I don't know who that person is, so I can't put them under any of those columns. So that was one of the key learnings. And of course, that was one of the purposes of the exercise, is that we tend to associate with a small number of people. And that's one reason why in churches, we tend to kind of call on the same people all of the time to do the work. You know, there's in nonprofit work, we talk about the 80-20 rule, that 20% of the people do 80% of the work. And that often, you know, you get the same 20% all the time. And it's not that other people don't want to do it, but often they're not called upon because often we don't even know who they are. And if we don't know who they are, we don't know what their gifts might be. So that's one of the things that is always a challenge for leadership in a Christian community, is to get to know the people and to know who they are and what the graces that have been bestowed upon them by God are. Now, whether the people want to use them or not, that's another question. Now that's a question for particularly the clergy in a parish, is to motivate people to want to use their gifts properly. That's what stewardship and discipleship is about. But the reality is that often we just, you know, we know people on a very small level, and we don't really we don't get worried about building communities in this brick by brick by brick way. So this notion of building, we had a stewardship campaign. Ours are year-long efforts, and they're about discipleship. They're not about money. So only. But the idea is that one year we talked about being living stones. Remember, we handed out stones in church. And the idea is that, you know, each one of us is one of those stones. And there are many people who aren't even in church to get one of those stones. And the idea is that we need to find out who they are and how they can contribute, again, not only with their shekels, you know, with their dollars and cents, but more importantly, with the gifts that God has given them, because all of us, according to St. Paul, right here, we just heard it, are given in proportion to their faith, so that all of us have something to contribute to this thing we call the body of Christ. So that's the learning on that lesson, and it is a bit related to the gospel lesson, which is where I want to concentrate today, which comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew, the 16th chapter, beginning at the 13th verse. And it's a familiar passage to us, and we're going to compare and contrast some things today. And it begins, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, but others Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Then he said to them, but who do you say that I am? Now Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Here ends the lesson. Now, my usual question is, what stands out to you?
The
Well, I
perceived.
guess for me, the giving the names of the great prophets of the past would be expected, but Peter, in all his kind of primitive wisdom, blares out, that you are the Messiah. And from Jesus' response, it was the response he was waiting for, and used that to teach. Mm-hmm. And so it's a complete break with their past feelings about who were the great prophets. We now have one in our midst.
Okay, good. It's interesting how you just said that. Peter blurted it out. Isn't that a typical Peter thing? Peter just, well, there out it comes.
He never did anything quietly.
Yeah, Peter, and he never thinks about it before he does it. We talked about that a few weeks ago with the Transfiguration. He speaks without thinking. And so but there's a pattern. We keep talking about that as a pattern. And so we might want to say that maybe there's something there to that Peter is speaking from a more intuitive place. That he's not necessarily a high thinker. It's not about deductive thinking, but intuitive insight.
Sometimes Peter is very blustery, and sometimes he's sort of naive. And in this case, from what you and George have said, it makes me think about having faith as a child in relationship to Peter, because he's sometimes confused, but it's a pure kind of understanding that he brings to this.
He's speaking from his heart.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of what we're talking about here. This sort of naivete, perhaps, a heart understanding, which is it's less head, more heart or gut. That's kind of what we mean by intuitive thinking. That it's sort of an insight as opposed to, it's just like, aha, it's right in front of me, I'm going to say it. Rather than it's not It's not the process of long deduction. It might have been a long time coming. It maybe wasn't easy there, but it just sort of arrives, and he speaks it. So it's more like a matter of discovery, perhaps. It's with Peter, there are these aha moments. Bernard Lonergan, a theologian, well-respected theologian, a very synthetic thinker. He's a dialectician, a Hegelian in many ways. Just thesis and antithesis, and he talks about those aha moments where we have in fact, in his philosophical method, he talks about insight. And that's actually very apropos to any of us who've worked in the sciences. That discovery comes when, you try and try and try, and then all of a sudden there's this, something comes along and you just suddenly, it dawns. I mean, we even have language, it dawns on you. And that's hard to describe for people. We can talk about deductive reasoning, that, you can go through the syllogisms and all that sort of thing. But that's almost a after the fact way of thinking of things. But true discoveries usually happen in this sort of insightful way, that things dawn on people. And I think statements of faith that way, and I think most people come to faith in those ways. It kind of dawns on people. It suddenly, oh my, that's what's happening. That's what it means. Or in a moment of awe, it's like that. I've described the moment that people say walk into St. Luke's Church for the first time, through those doors in the cloister, and they open the doors and they walk in, and it takes their breath away. I'm not saying they're having a religious experience at that point in time, but it's close to that, where suddenly they're overcome with something. Hopefully it does move them to appreciate something deeper, or a turn of phrase in a sermon, or reading a Bible verse that they've heard a gazillion times in their life, and then suddenly they heard it in a new way, or they read it in a new way. That new way, that insight comes, and it changes things. Can you think of a time in your own life when that's happened?
Well, a couple of times. When shortly after we got married and we were in the west side of Chicago, a kitty corner from our apartment was a Episcopal missionary house that was run by a priest that had been part of the seminary at the University of Chicago. He had Friday night suppers, and he brought in faculty from the University of Chicago. And Betty and I were just kind of onlookers because these people were so far above our head. But there came for me a different understanding of how to understand Scripture in a way that was so much more enlightening. And when we moved from there, we got into a parish where the priest was terrific. And he had that ability to take complicated theological discussion and bring out the one or two essentials that we could carry away with us. And then my relationship to the Episcopal Church took an important improvement, for lack of a better word. The second time was when I was dealing with children who had warts that grew in their throat, which is a terrible thing because it'll asphyxiate them. So you have to remove them on a regular basis. And then it dawned on me to ask the mother, do you have any vaginal warts? And the answer was invariably yes. And so that was before we thought of vaginal warts as being a sexually transmitted disease. And I was on the cusps of that, but couldn't quite see it yet. And the thing that got me, I wanted to take those warts and make a vaccine for these children. It didn't work very well, but it did work with cows and bulls. And in England, the veterinarian wrote a paper that talked about when you had a bull who was your prize animal that they brought their cows in to because the offspring produced really good milk. If that bull got a papilloma on his penis, and they did, and they were called angleberries, and they got to be about the size of a peach hanging off the tip of the penis. So that put him out of business for the farmer. And so this guy took the angleberry, emulsified it into some kind of a solution, and injected it back into the bull. And the bull didn't grow any more papillomas.
Oh.
And they found that they could inject it into the hide of a horse and it would grow on the skin. And by diluting it, they could figure out how much of whatever it was in there. They didn't even know it was a virus yet. We didn't understand viruses. And they could predict how much, how the concentration that would protect the bull from that. And it was probably 10 or 20 years after that we got into the whole aspect of sexually transmitted human papillomavirus. And now we see ads on the television to, when your child gets to be 9 years old, get him vaccinated with a papillomavirus that really works.
Right.
Because, yeah. So that was a scientific revelation for me. But in a way, it's related to something comes up and all of a sudden it makes sense.
Right. Well, and that's, in terms of, what I was just talking about in terms of insight, in terms of even scientific knowledge, that's true on so many different levels in human understanding. So that when we start talking about even this, in terms of faith understanding, that we come to faith and our understanding. So Peter, in this case, is coming to an understanding of who Jesus is, almost like he's been living with Jesus, he's been walking with Jesus, he's been talking with Jesus, he's been watching what Jesus is doing. All of this, we'll call it data, has been coming into his experience. And Jesus is asking them, who do people say that I am? And all these other people are saying, yeah, he talks like John the Baptizer. And we've talked about that, how Jesus may have been a disciple of John's, in the early days and so on. And he had this relationship with John the Baptizer, some say his cousin and all this sort of thing. So some would say, oh, he's kind of like John. Other people say he's the second coming of Elijah, the great prophet, because he's such a great preacher, and he's predicting the uprising of Israel and all this kind of stuff. So there's that school of thought. And but Jesus turns to his own disciples, and he says, well, who do you think? Who do you say that I am? Peter is just all of a sudden struck.
Yeah.
That question is just put to him in such a way that it crystallizes this in his brain. And he says, you can almost see him, like the eyes open, and he says, what? You're the Messiah of Christ. You're the Christ of God. It all just comes together.
Yeah.
And Jesus then says, no mere mortal has revealed this to you. In other words, you have a direct insight into the mind of God in seeing this. That this is not, nobody's taught you this. Nobody has given you this in a book. Nobody, because you're not we could say it this way, you're not a learned man, you're not a learned person. No rabbi has been going around saying, look for this, look for this, look for this, look for this. You yourself have come to this insight, which means that someone has placed this on your heart. We would say, in retrospect, this was the work of the Holy Spirit in the life of Peter.
And Jesus, up until this point, was a great teacher.
Yeah.
And yet he avoided saying to them, I am the Messiah that has been sent down to you by my Father. No, doesn't say anything like that. And I think he was really hoping that Peter or one of the other disciples would blurt it out at him without having been coaxed to say it.
Well, of course, we also have to think on this. Kathy and I were having this discussion just yesterday. How much did Jesus know about himself in the moment? We have to remember that all of these stories about Jesus were written after the fact and sometime after the fact. So these are post factum reflections on the life of Jesus, on the life of the disciples, and so on. So that's why I just said what I said a bit, that this is a reflection on how do we come to the realization? How do we come to the conclusion that Jesus is the Messiah, except by what the church is teaching us in Matthew? Oh, actually, this is said in all of the Gospels. These words are put in Peter's mouth. That and in this way, in this manner, so that this becomes a deep conviction of the church, that this revelation that Jesus is the Messiah is the work of the direct work of the Holy Spirit in the believer's heart. And so it is a great discovery that we all undergo. In other words, this is a conviction of faith that we all must come to individually, but by the testimony of the church. Which leads us then to the next step in our passage here, which is this notion of the whole notion of the rock, the church. What is the rock? This is, I said we're going to do a little comparing and contrast. This is one of those passages that is often served as a proof text among our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters for the primacy of Peter, the whole, papacy, all that kind of stuff. That this is the proof text for the authority of the papacy, but that's really only a fairly, I would say, even dare say, use the term modern interpretation that comes only over the last few centuries. And that talk about modern. few centuries, since it's a post-Reformation interpretation, really. The primacy of the papacy is more ecclesiastical than it is theological. And it has to do with the fact that the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, and Rome is one of the last genuinely apostolic sees. In other words, one of the churches founded by the apostles, which is still an extant church. And so it was always considered primus inter pares, the first among equals. And that goes way back into the earliest history of the church. And that's a better argument for the primacy of the Roman See, more so than this passage of scripture. But, when the argumentation happened during the Reformation that it has to be somehow rooted in scripture, everybody went scurrying through scripture looking for scriptural justifications, and this one emerged. But it was only post-Reformation that this became that proof text for, saying that this was Jesus appointing Peter Pope. It was like, no, that's not what this is about. However, what is this imagery of the rock? We could ask the question, what is the rock that Jesus is talking about here? Peter gets that name. His name is actually Simon. Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon son of John, Simon son of Jonah, depending on how you want to translate the Greek. Simon Bar-Jonah is what his name is in Hebrew or Aramaic. Simon son of John, we would say in English. So he is called Petrus or Cephas. Petrus is the word rock. That's how we get Peter. So why is he called the rock? Why is Peter named the rock? Is it because of his personal qualifications?
Well, his strength, rock is the foundation.
Okay, is Peter the foundation? The Roman Catholics would say yes.
I'm gonna say a rock is a strong place. I'm not saying that he is the only foundation, but when you start looking into the Acts of the Apostles, he's giving great abilities later on in his life.
And Acts, he's the one who emerges after the Pentecost event, and
yeah,
so there's that. But in this particular pericope, this particular passage is when he gets this title. So what about this passage there? What is it that makes him the rock?
The rock is unshakable.
It's okay. But what is, so the rock is foundational. But think about the hymn, for example. Even in the Roman Catholic Church, when English hymns were first implemented, with the reform of the Second Vatican Council, one of the things we sing in every Catholic church at every Mass, it seemed for a while, was the church is one foundation. It was not Peter, it was Jesus Christ our Lord. So was Peter the foundation, or was Jesus the foundation? Was Peter the rock, or was Jesus the rock?
So is Jesus in this? No, wait. On this rock I will build my church. Is Jesus referring to Peter alone, or Peter on Christ as the rock?
See, here we go. Or is it Peter's affirmation of faith? Or is it the truth that Peter just affirmed? So is the rock Jesus? Is the rock the truth? That is the rock the movement of faith? it could be either of any of those or all of them. But see, they're personified in this dialogue between Jesus and Peter. So it isn't necessarily Peter the person. It's in the relationship between Jesus and Peter.
Well, just before that, Peter again is not called a rock, but he is a rock, because he tries to come to Jesus on the water and he sinks like a stone.
Things like a rock. Great.
But he made an attempt, which none of the others in the boat apparently did. And so if he's with the other disciples and he blurts this out, this is a really strong acknowledgement of his understanding that Jesus is the Messiah.
Yeah. There's no getting away from this. Again, using the word primacy is a loaded term, given the issue of Roman Catholicism and the papacy and all that stuff. But let's use it for a moment with a small p, taking away all the baggage from that word. Let's just use the word as it's in the dictionary. The notion of primacy, because you have it here, you have it as you just described it. You even have it in John's gospel, particularly in the post-resurrection appearances when Jesus and Peter are having that dialogue on the shore of the Sea of Tiberias. Who does he entrust the sheep to? Peter. Who denied why, in the Gospels, in the Passion narratives, they pick Peter out for particular, opprobrium, because Peter's the one who said, I don't know the man. The denial of Peter. That's a scene in the Passion narratives. And then in John's gospel, you have this lovely reconciliation scene where, Peter, do you love me? Of course, Lord, I love you, and it's back and forth. And then you do have the affirmation of Acts when, after the Pentecost event, who comes out and preaches to the crowd in the square? Peter. Who's the one who has that first revelation relative to the Gentile, the welcome of the Gentile, the vision about Cornelius, and he baptizes Cornelius' family? Peter. Of course, but Peter also has this sort of waffly personality, so he's well, I'm not too sure about this, and it takes Paul and the argument with Paul, to kind of solidify this idea about the Gentiles, so there's this. But again, in Christian iconography, then what happens is you always have, and almost always you have, this notion of Peter and Paul. Peter, the apostle to whom? To the Jew.
Yeah.
Paul, the apostle to whom?
The world.
Gentile. And almost always you have the two of them together. I mean, they are also known separately, obviously. But, for example, the National Cathedral in our own church, what's considered, the principal cathedral of the Episcopal Church. It's where the presiding bishop is seated as the presiding bishop. It's the seat of the Diocese of Washington. Is not the national, that's not its formal title. The formal title is the Cathedral Church of Saints Peter and Paul. So you have that sort of thing going on, and frequently in iconography throughout Christendom, you have the two of them juxtaposed against one another. But this notion of St. Peter being the one who is the first to acclaim Christ or Jesus as the Christ, always again taking into account that the Gospels are, post factum reflections, theological reflections on this mystery of the Paschal mystery of Jesus, the incarnational realities that Jesus was a human being, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, self-revelatory over time, into the passion, into the death, into the resurrection, and so on. So that when we understand that, then we have this great discovery, this insightful affirmation of faith, as it's told to us by the early church. But also that one of the sort of subtleties in this particular passage is that we then prescind, we go over and above normal human categories. Jesus is not merely a teacher. You've already said this, but let's solidify it. Jesus is not merely a teacher. Jesus is not merely a prophet. Jesus is not merely a miracle worker. Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one of God. Oh, I'm not talking to you. So Jesus is beyond our human categories. So Matthew, when he writes his gospel, and Luke and Mark and John, when they're writing the gospels, they are putting now Jesus into this superhuman category. I don't mean superhuman like Superman or superhero, but rather into a category that's beyond our former categories in terms of any human being that was related to God. So now we're getting Jesus into the whole Son of God thing. That's why in some of in one or another of the gospel passages in this dialogue, you are the Son of the living God. The other thing that this passage then goes into is this promise about, and the gates of hell will not prevail. I'm going to ask you a question. What's the function of a gate?
Keep people out or keep people in.
Yeah.
Oh,
Depends where the gate is, isn't it?
Yeah.
What's it, like in a cemetery, is the function of a gate to keep people in? Yeah, exactly. So when Jesus, it's always like, I remember as a kid listening to I can't quite understand what the gates of hell thing is all about. But the gates of hell will not prevail. I'm not quite sure I've never been quite sure what that means. I'm still not quite sure what that means. When you hear that phrase, what does that mean to you?
Those that are there may now be free. It's we're thinking that it's a place where evildoers wind up, and if that's the case, if they are unrepentant, they are kept there. But if the gates are not closed to everyone forever, that there is forgiveness, there is growth, there is reason to have hope if that is where you wind up. Now, I don't know that we think so much these days of winding up in a burning hell, although we're turning the earth into it. But that was I think an image that was had in the past. But there are different ways of thinking of hell. But the way there has to be some aspect of hope for even the worst.
Kathy.
Well, we're talking about gates to keep people out or in, but the other important feature of a gate is it's movable. It could, if it wouldn't be able to be moved, it would just be a wall.
Right, so it's open or closed.
It could open and close, yeah.
Okay.
So that I think that's an important feature of it, because it's telling you that it's not that hell can open, the gates of hell can open, but they can't take over the goodness of goodness of Jesus, or however you want to describe it. And I don't know if goodness is a good word to use, but cannot prevail over Jesus.
Right. The church.
So there's Kathy, and gates that are open to entice people away from God and to entice people away from Jesus, but they will not prevail.
Well, let's think about what they're the gates to. All three of you just described something that really is probably not what Jesus was thinking about.
Okay, death.
Hello there, Ellen.
More than likely,
Pretty good.
what Jesus is talking when we talk about hell in the New Testament,
Station with joy.
we're not talking about the hell that we think of.
And
Remember the old language of the creed? Jesus descended into hell.
you found a new answer.
Or then it was variously translated, he descended to the dead.
Because the day he arrived,
Because
it
it was like what was the old Greek and Roman idea of Hades, or the underworld? That was the ancient understanding of that. Our notion of hell is a place of punishment and ever burning fire, and that really emerged. And most of our conceptions of hell as we have it in the modern era is more attuned to Dante's Inferno than it is from a biblical understanding of what hell is. Now, there are the images of Revelation, which is where Dante gets some of that from. But it is not about the individual souls in Revelation. What dwells there?
Surprising.
The dead.
Judith, I couldn't hear you.
I said the dead, and
Not the
Jesus
dead in Revelation.
damned. I don't know.
Satan.
Okay.
It is the dwelling place of evil.
Okay.
It is where Lucifer was condemned to after the great war that's described in Job and in Isaiah. When Michael and Lucifer have their great battle, and Lucifer loses, the light bearer is consigned to the netherworld. So it's this ancient notion of the underworld. And it is not necessarily this place of punishment and torment. The one place in the New Testament where there is some talk of that is when Jesus talks about Gehenna, where the fire never goes out and the worm never dies. Actually, that is a physical place that he's describing. It's the garbage dump outside of Jerusalem.
Oh.
And the reason he describes it is because, and that's exactly what he describes, because what happens at a garbage dump? It's constantly being replenished. Garbage. And what happens with garbage is the reason why the fire never dies, or the fire never goes out and the worm never dies, is because what's there is constantly being consumed. So it's not a place of eternal torment. It's a place where what goes there disappears. I mean, if you want to get granular about it, we cease to exist when we go there. You want to take that imagery to its logical conclusion. It's an image of hell where it's not an eternal. The eternal part of it is that its existence is eternal, not our existence within it. And even it's interesting because that was one of the descriptions that the late Pope John Paul II, when asked what his conception of hell was not a place of this sort of tormentous punishment, but rather eternal separation from the divine person. And that was alone itself this sort of notion of utter dissolution, being, forever separated from the ground of being. Most of what we really actually have in our brains as the image, the poetic image of hell, is a description, a cultural description given to us from the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance. I don't think that's what Jesus was saying when he says the gates of hell. So that what we can then begin to understand him when he says the gates of hell will not prevail. What's he saying? Essentially, we could say possibly, the forces of evil. Because who's behind the gates of hell? Satan. You are Peter. You are the rock. And on this rock I will build my church. And the forces of evil will never prevail against it. And so then we read the rest of the New Testament. We get to the book of Revelation, which is John's revelation, John's interpretation. What happens there? There's the great cosmic battle between good and evil. And what happens? Good wins. Isn't that the fulfillment of the promise? The great beast is cast down forever and destroyed. Kathy, you're smiling all of a sudden.
Well, I'm actually kind of laughing. And I haven't read Revelations lately. But these images of some of these creatures, that's what I was laughing about and smiling about. It's kind of like, sometime I would love to see what some of these creatures really look,
Well, yeah, 7 heads and
Yeah.
But because they're fantastical. I mean,
oh yeah, I don't expect them to actually, that was all metaphor basically.
Well, but I think sometimes John was on peyote or LSD,
Hey, he could have been.
He lived on an island that does not have water. They have to bring fresh water in. So he could have been in some
he was on,
state.
Magic mushrooms or something, it was, but regardless, I mean, even people who do psychedelics, I mean, there's even great treatments now for people on PTSD and all this kind of stuff with, controlled psychedelic treatments and things, that it says that it opens up new realities. There's certain clarity that comes to them. These insight, again, here we go with insight again, that they have renewed insight into their own lives, a renewed clarity that, with a controlled journey into the depths of their own psyche, that when this happens, they have this kind of clarity that maybe that's exactly what John was having. And, that the clarity of this notion of the cosmic battle between good and evil, maybe that insight that Peter was having relative to, I mean, not that Peter was on mushrooms or something when he did this, but that notion of that Jesus is the Christ.
Yeah.
And that, again, the post factum, declaration of this, Jesus, is saying the gates of hell will not prevail. He's not saying that, I mean, when we talk about hell, we're not talking about that Dante's Inferno, the seventh level of hell, but what we're talking about is that the forces of evil will not prevail. That where Satan dwells and everything that that represents will not be strong enough to destroy the church, because it is founded on the rock. And what is the rock? But the Christ, the anointed one of God. And who is the anointed of God? None other than God, God's self. Now, it is said, it's interesting because it is said in, I think it's the Sufi school of spirituality that interprets the great battle between Michael and Lucifer in the Old Testament. That because the whole concept of Islam is about the will of God, and interprets the great battle between Lucifer and Michael. And what do their names mean? What is Lucifer? What does Lucifer mean?
A light, a fire.
The light bearer, the light
Yeah.
bearer. And Michael is the strength of God. Micah is, something that is very hard. It is the strength of God. Micah El. El meaning is Elohim. It is the name of God. So Michael, and that the battle between them ensues because God said, when God creates heaven and earth and he creates humanity, he says to the angels of the heavens, you will serve this thing that I have made, which is humanity. And all the angels said, yes, I will. And it is Lucifer who says, I will not serve such a thing as this created thing that you have made. I serve only you. And God says, no, you will serve what I have made. And so what ensues is this battle between the quote-unquote good angels and the bad angels. The good angels are good because they do God's will. And the bad angels are bad because they refuse to do God's will, because they think they know better than God, because they will only serve God. But see what there's the irony of it. In saying that they will only serve God, they are in fact not serving God because they're not doing what God wants.
Well, it gets back to way back. Somebody must have said to his rabbi, well, if God could do all of this, why didn't he just forget about creating evil? He just make good, and we don't have to worry about it. But
well,
no.
This whole thing is that he didn't actually create evil. What he did was allow us to be free.
Yeah. But then as theology evolved, the great thing that we have in us is that we have the choice and the intellect to decide one over the other and behave or direct our lives in one direction or another.
Because ultimately, if we're not free, it comes back to that question of love.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If God created so that God could be loved in return for his love, or for God's love, I should say, that which would return God's love cannot love if that which God made could not be free. So consequently, the capacity not to be free, or the capacity to love requires freedom, as we have come to understand what love is. So consequently, one must be able to choose not. And the capacity is what is the problem. So that when we talk about what's called a theodicy, which is an understanding, or what one might say the justification of evil, that doesn't mean to justify doing evil, but rather an intellectual justification why evil exists. The ultimate theodicy is freedom. That the only way we can justify the existence of evil in the world is the capacity for human freedom. So in order to justify love at all, because, and that, it's an interesting conversation, because for a while it didn't really make much difference for us. But now, for example, as we move into the very scary arena of AI, artificial intelligence, this becomes a very relevant conversation. Because can an artificial intelligence be genuinely free? Can you manufacture freedom? Or is it always deterministic?
Mhm.
And where does the element of freedom exist? Is it in the creator of the intelligence? Because then you have to question the God question. See, because if God ever made us so that we are totally determined, then there is no evil in the world. There is only what God made. And God, this is all just this, we're just all little automatons in this little artificial world that God set going. So there's no sense of responsibility. There's no real justice. There's none of the values that we think we all understand, virtue, vice, all of that kind of stuff, all disappears. It's all premised on the notion of freedom. Freedom is an essential element of our existence. So consequently, the whole concept of love is a determining factor in our nature as human beings. This is a very deep philosophy here. And that is premised on the notion of human freedom. That's why freedom is such a critical element in determining the dignity of human beings. So when we take our baptismal promises and so on, when we say we strive for justice and peace, and we respect the dignity of all human beings, one of the things we always have to look for is, are we actually working for the genuine freedom on every level of human existence, not just political freedom. Political freedom is where it's probably most obvious and most practicable. But there's psychological freedom, there's physical freedom, there are all kinds of levels of freedom on which we live. And we, as Christian disciples, need to be operating on all of those levels of freedom, both personally and corporately. So when someone comes to this deep realization, as Peter, that they can say, yes, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. It is a free decision. It is not compelled. It isn't compelled by torture or the threat of imprisonment or being burnt at the stake or being drawn and quartered because you don't ascribe to a set of creeds. So the church has a lot to answer for in its history. Whether you're Catholic or Protestant, whether you're Orthodox or whatever, we all share this burden of this human sense that we think we're right, and so on, and so consequently we have sinned against the fundamental dignity of humans. And so as we go into this new horizon, of artificial intelligence, one of the most critical things that I think we face are the ethical questions about human freedom. How will this be used as a tool to enhance freedom? Or will it end up being something that negates human freedom and turns us into mere, it will manipulate people in such a way that they no longer can exercise this genuine sense of freedom. That's why even our political environment today, I think, is so toxic, is because so many people's freedom has genuinely been taken away from them because of the way we get information and so on. They basically have been entrapped through social media and any number of other elements that they can't determine as to whether or not these things are true. If you can't think, if you can't figure out truth, then you can't be free.
I can't help but think about the movie 2002 or whatever it was.
2001.
When
Hal.
the computer Hal
Mm-hmm.
Was given so much knowledge that he could make ethical decisions for the lives of human beings. And he even wondered if he could dream. Remember what he asked? As he realized they were pulling his brain out from him, will I dream? And so that it was a kind of a profound realization that, and they hadn't thought of the term artificial intelligence when that movie was made.
Yeah.
But that is one of the fears that we are now wondering about as we are really getting into it.
Yes.
And will we have machines that make ethical decisions concerning us, or that it has no reason to care if we live or die?
That's correct. And the issue is even deeper, George, when you start to think about the issue. You talked about scientific discovery relative to viruses and so on earlier. As we look at neuroscience and we get deeper into how the brain actually works, how our emotions are tied to certain chemical reactions within the brain, psychiatric science relative to mental disease, and how pharmacology and how we can control. I mean, this has been an ethical question all along with psychiatric pharmacology and Brave New World, Aldous Huxley and all that.
Yeah.
The question becomes, how much can we control? How much should we control people? What is the good? What is a good life? One of the questions, for example, at the general ordination exam about 5 years ago was about the good life. When is it appropriate, for example, for someone to determine that they no longer are living the good life? And I don't mean in terms of environment, in terms of like where they live in a house and all that sort of thing, but in terms of their physical well-being and so on, that they would then be able to make a decision about ending their own life, assisted suicide and those kinds of things. Where we make those ethical decisions, what is the capacity? What are the limits of freedom? Those kinds of things. These are tough decisions. And when you start talking about machines making, machines, quote unquote, AI making those decisions.
May I make a comment here based on what George was saying? First of all, I'm an advocate for art, and I just ordered a book called Your Brain on Art, and how art influences and promotes so much in how you perceive the world and how you behave and everything. But think about the dreamers and the artists who created futuristic type movies and programs.
Mhm.
I think of Star Trek, Data. He is a robot,
Mhm.
and he's logical. He has no feelings, but he is always on the side of good and on the side of the people he's surrounded by. C-3PO in Star Wars is often confused, but he basically is attuned to the needs of the people with whom he resides. And the cartoon Wall-E, he's a little robot flying around in space, but he has a heart, which is not a heart, but he has this sense of right and wrong. And that's because of the creators of the
Yes.
films who have put into those films a positive spin on an artificially intelligent thing.
Well, it goes back, you say creator, but that's the creator of the film, but also we have to talk about the creator of the AI thing itself.
Right.
Is that when the programmer, we want to call it programmer,
Right.
the programmer can do for good or for ill.
Right.
And that's where the crux comes relative to the ethics of the entire program, capital P, all capital letters if you want, this entire endeavor, let's call it an endeavor. And when you really get into, and you talk to the people at Google and you know all the people who are into this whole process, they are struggling with this as well, because you know the thing is it can go off on its own, which is part of the challenge. That this whole notion of how do we actually put this thing together so that there are some guardrails so that it can be used for good and we minimize its use for ill. This goes back to the conversations. I mean, Oppenheimer just came out relative to the movie, relative to the atomic age. Somebody just made the parallel in an interview recently I listened to, that we are at that stage now with this. It's a whole new age for humanity. And just like atomic energy can be used for tremendous good. I mean, just look at the medical science that, you know, we have insight into the human body. We can see disease portions of the body that we could never see before. We can see cancer, for example, in its incipient stage and, you know, treat it so early and get rid of it and all that sort of thing, or treat it, you know, as a disease using radiation and all that, which was not possible 100 years ago or 75 years ago. Now, but we have atomic bombs. We could destroy the world. You know, the same thing can be true of AI. We got into all this conversation because of this notion of insight.
I think I might have nightmares tonight when I go to sleep. But
but the idea that, you know, but the same thing is true, that this is the working of the human mind,
right.
And that this notion of the will of God and the working of the Holy Spirit in the mind, that, you know, we use images like the Holy Spirit, we use this notion of God, and our conceptions of it are anthropomorphized. And so even when we study the Bible, we're studying an ancient culture's anthropomorphization of divine realities. But the divine realities themselves, like the gates of hell, or Peter itself, you know, the notion of Peter, the notion even of the incarnation of Jesus becoming the Son of God, the divine person becoming enfleshed part of creation. The mystery of that is that the creator became part of the created. That's an amazing concept if you think about it. That Christianity is the only religion in the world in the history of humankind where that created energy, that creative force, has become part of its own creation. There isn't another religion in the world that says that. So that the fate of the created order is in part the fate of the created energy itself. So that's why it is so critical for us as Christians to understand that we are now part of the God life that we profess. God is not separate from us. We are part of God. We aren't God, but we are part of God. And that's what's going on here. So that when Jesus says, "You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates," we could then say this term, "the forces of evil will never prevail against it." We are on a trajectory where what Jesus is saying is the forces of good, you have the capacity within your grasp for total reconciliation with the divine. And it will happen if you don't stop it. Only you can stop, or I should say, delay it. Because what we are taught by Jesus is it is God's will. And it will happen sooner or later. Only you, in your freedom, can delay it.
But we need help along the way.
Oh, absolutely.
and I've been convinced that there are some people who have been given a gift to help us, because some of this is too profound for us to figure out on our own. Most of us, that is, and so that down through the ages, I think we can name people who have been given something special.
So we
And
have
they've kept us on the right track.
the Dalai Lama, we have Desmond Tutu. I mean, in our own experience, we have Mother Teresa. We have, in various religious traditions, in the Christian tradition itself, we have people who will. I just read, and it's extremely powerful, and I highly recommend reading Justin Welby's book on reconciliation. At first I didn't think, just another book on reconciliation. He is really, it's extremely insightful. He's extremely honest about it for a change. Most people are very idealistic about it. He's extremely honest and straightforward about it. What a difficult work it is, and that it isn't a panacea, it isn't a placebo, it isn't this kind of thing that just will solve all the world's problems, that kind of thing. But it's work that we need to get our hands dirty in, and we need to start doing it. And it's from everything from international, it's at every level, from international reconciliation down to the family. And one of the things he touches on is our reconciliation with the created order relative to climate change and so on. It's well done, very readable, very palatable. It needs to be read.
May I make a comment about something that's totally different, but it prompted my thinking in this reading. The very last thing, it says, Jesus sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Mm-hmm. So he's among the disciples. This event happens with Peter. Don't you wonder what all the other disciples were thinking?
Oh yeah, always. Who the hell do you think he is?
Because this is teacher's pet, who is often bumbling, but and when you look at the walking on the water episode, and then we're coming later on to the transfiguration, which we discussed the other week, the disciples were very faithful in the face of the fact that There were times Jesus singled out certain ones for closer communication or whatever.
We constantly hear about Peter, James, and John.
Yeah.
You know, so he had, you know, there was the concentric circles kind of thing.
Right, right. And we don't have any commentary because it isn't really relevant, but it makes me wonder. It's like, you know, the pastor or the priest and the church council know things that the rest of us don't. Or, you know, why is it, like you said, about 20% of the people doing 80% of the work? Well, why is that person always worship assistant or reader or whatever? Well, sometimes it boils down to other people are afraid to do it or don't want to be in the limelight. So I think about all of the people surrounding Jesus who observed this moment. And I wonder what was going through their minds at the time.
Well, this is an opportunity just to kind of plug something that I'm very strong on, and that is St. Ignatius' contemplation of place, which is to pray in such a way as to place yourself in the scene as either one of the people in the scene, say in this case, to pray with this scriptural passage by becoming one of those disciples watching this happen and becoming one of them and saying, actually, you know, getting yourself quiet and so on, and then reading the passage and actually becoming one of those people in your mind, your mind's eye. And what would you be thinking at that time? What would you be thinking at that? And or being a bystander watching this happen and saying, and then listening to the conversation among the other 10 or 11 of people standing around, you know, those kinds of things. That's part of the Ignatian method of prayer. It's called contemplation of place, so that you can actually experience. And, you know, it's not definitive in the sense, it doesn't teach you any kind of truth as to what that Bible passage says, but it can give us insight into the spiritual reality that the heart teaches if we do this on a regular basis.
Well, one of those disciples became, you know, was Judas.
Right.
And he must have formed his ideas.
Well, and, you know, again, I've prayed through this because I am an Ignatian by prayer method. And one of the things that I've come to a deep conclusion is Judas really wasn't as bad as some of the narratives like to kind of paint him. I think he was deceived. He deceived himself. He was a bit of a, he thought he could manipulate Jesus into this notion of his messiahship was more political than he was spiritual. And again, you know, this is because of the way that the Gospels were written, you know, moving after the fact, that because even, you know, he in a way repents, he regrets what he did, but he despairs of Jesus' forgiveness, which is why he went and killed himself. This notion of, oh my God, what did I do? That's why he tosses the money back into the temple. I mean, when you really get the whole picture, you know, we want to paint him as this, you know, traitor, which he did do. I mean, he betrayed Jesus, but he had a higher motive for doing it. He was trying to force Jesus' hand into finally, you know, get the damn Romans out of Jerusalem. You got the crowd behind you now. We just had this big triumphal procession into Jerusalem, and they were all, oh, hail, King of the Jews, you know, King, you know, son of David, laying their cloaks on, you know, it was the perfect time. And he thought he knew better and all this kind of stuff. So he thought this was the way to do it. And when Jesus just capitulated and he just said, oh my God, what did I do? Now, and I always like to juxtapose Judas against Peter. Peter did the same thing in a way. He denied knowing Jesus, but Peter repented of that denial without despair. Judas repented, but despaired of forgiveness. And the juxtaposition teaches us the importance of grace, where the repentance with the hope of forgiveness produced what we see in John's gospel on the Sea of Tiberias, as opposed to what happened to Judas. So, Judas wasn't such a bad guy.
Did everyone here seen the latest version of Jesus Christ Superstar with John Legend?
Yes.
Because I was gonna say, I think that presents a wonderful case for Judas.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was so well done.
Yeah.
Is he described anywhere as a zealot with political?
The zealot, the one who is described as a zealot, is not this Judas.
Right.
But the zealots were, there were a lot of them. And I mean, many people did see Jesus as the leader of the uprising.
Right.
And they were a conquered nation, they weren't very happy about it. No.
I mean, that's why a lot of the Pharisees wanted to do away with Jesus, was because he was rocking the boat. They saw their privileged position getting questioned, and there's a political hermeneutic that you can read into the end of Jesus' ministry that was perhaps the very reason why Jesus was crucified. It had very little to do with blasphemy and all that kind of stuff. It was more, a worry about the tender balance that the powers that be in Judah had worked out with the Roman authorities, and worried about the loss of the freedoms that they had worked out. And so they, in some ways, the Sanhedrin was more concerned about keeping both their own personal power, which is always a factor in that, but also, keeping the Romans at bay as far as they had thus far, rather than bring the whole wrath of the empire down on them, which eventually happened, 20, 25 years later.
Can I ask a real quick question that's semi-related to this?
Mm-hmm.
I was reading in some work that I was doing yesterday that the Jews that paid it, one of the things that the Jews had worked out was a tax that they paid to Rome so they wouldn't have to worship the Roman gods.
Yes.
Okay. That's what I got out. I was trying to figure out why the Jews didn't like the Romans, or what life was like under Roman occupation.
That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. They had worked all these things out, and they didn't want to lose that. See.
You can guess where that's going.
Yeah.
But they were still allowed to worship at their temple.
Right.
The Romans hadn't closed or torn down the temple yet.
Right.
Well, that's because of the tax. That's because of the tax that they paid.
Right. And in the end, that's what caused the temple to be destroyed, was because they had had enough of that. And as long as that temple existed, that was the center of protest. So get rid of that, and we don't have any problem anymore.
Yeah.
So that's why, that was the whole imperial thing. So, all right, well, we're way past time, so we'll let you go. This was a most interesting passage, and we got into all kinds of very interesting conversations about the human mind, about freedom, about decision making, about insight, about religious faith, all because Peter, in his impetuosity, blurts out something. But again, to bring back, full circle, that it's not simply, this sort of, Peter. There's much more to it than that. It's about this notion of faith and that all faith comes to us through the work of the Holy Spirit. And that Spirit works in the human heart and the mind. And that when Jesus recognizes this in the narrative, that then begins the foundational elements of the church. And that in the notion of the church, there is this beginning of this cosmic battle between good and evil, which endures to this very day. Peace.
Okay.
Yeah.